All right, well, it is 6 o'clock, so we will go ahead and start our webinar for tonight. Thank you, everybody, for signing up for this and for tuning in. This is the first webinar in a series that I've launched here with CCE Chautauqua just to get some learning opportunities throughout the winter season and start talking a little bit about things to think about as we approach another awesome growing season as spring and summer starts to roll around. So tonight we're going to talk all about backyard composting. This is near and dear to my heart personally. And I will go a little bit into just a bit about myself to give some prefaces to why I love composting so much. So I'm Eliza Hensel. I'm the natural resource educator here in Chautauqua County for CCE. But I've had a bit of a journey that's taken me to get to here today. So I got my undergrad in environmental studies and animal studies from Eckerd College. It's a great small school in Florida. And I found my passion for composting as a job on a campus farm there, actually. After I graduated college, I wanted to keep working in urban agriculture, composting, so I raised a little bit of money and I started my own grassroots composting collection program called Blue Bucket Compost. That's the photo down on the lower right-hand corner with all those black bins. I started my own community composting program on a local community farm and collected food scraps from around town. I like to include that story in case anyone here is interested in initiatives like that. I'd be more than happy to talk to you about that, uh, talk to you about my experience, and mentor people through starting their own programs. After that, that gave me enough of experience with composting to land a job with Michigan State University Extension. Up on the upper left photo there, that's me standing on a giant windrow turner at a composting conference. Believe it or not, they have those. And I worked there for the last 2 years as their composting systems educator and specialist. Had a great time and then moved out here to CCE Chautauqua this summer. My fiance started medical school out in Erie, so that brought us to this part of the country. And I'm super happy to be here sharing my knowledge and learning all about New York and the area and talking about composting here tonight. I also, this year, throughout the summer, completed my USDA compost subject matter expert training. So that gave me the ability to compost livestock mortalities and some of those trickier things that the USDA deals with on a national scale when resolving farm and livestock incidents and using compost to problem solve some of those incidents. So, just a little bit to give a little bit of background as to what brings me here today. So, enough about me. Let's dig in for what we're all here to learn about tonight, which is composting. So, before I go into the rest of my presentation, it's important to understand that whether you're doing it in a wheelbarrow bin, a rotating bin, doing it in a trench style compost, or just a typical three bin system, there's no one size fits all with composting as far as what's the best way to do it. What's going to help you be successful is understanding the principles of compost, how a healthy pile works, and that's what we're going to cover tonight. So, what is composting? Composting is defined as the biological decomposition of organic matter in a controlled environment, and the goal here is to produce a beneficial soil amendment. Oftentimes, I hear people call compost a fertilizer and they compare it to a fertilizer. But it's really important to understand that it's a soil amendment, and we need to think of compost as not only helping our plants thrive, but more than anything, it's helping our soil become healthier. It's kind of like taking a probiotic for your digestive system. It's going to help you digest better, it's going to help your body function better. The same thing applies for putting compost into our soil. It's going to create a better growing environment. We're going to improve our soil quality by increasing the microbial populations, but we're also being able to do that through reducing our own organic waste, whether that's yard debris, food waste, maybe it's manure if you have some animals on your property. And the whole reason we're going to do that is to improve our soil while also reducing that waste. So whether you're doing it to get rid of stuff or you're doing it because you want to produce that great soil amendment, all good reasons to start composting. So I throw this quote up there because it really resonates with me. The nation that destroys its soil destroys itself. Soil is so important to everything in our, not only our food, but even just our health in general, right? We have healthier, more nutrient-dense food. We're going to have healthier lives, healthier bodies. And all that comes back to our soil. So some of the reasons why we might want to use compost are things like we see here. We can improve our water retention. I'll explain a little bit more about all of these later as we go on. We're also going to help prevent soil erosion, which goes in hand with improving that water retention. By having compost in our soil, we're improving the tilth, the texture, the consistency of our soil. We're adding organic matter into depleted soils. All of those things go hand in hand to create a better, more rich environment in that soil. That's going to help hold on to moisture. It's going to help roots develop. It's going to help plants access some of those nutrients, increasing that nutrient bioavailability. It's also going to increase the microbial populations and the microbial biodiversity in the soil. Like I just said before, it's kind of like taking a probiotic for your digestive system. That's the same thing. Think about adding compost into your soil. And so then that goes hand in hand with possibly being able to help prevent plant diseases, right? So if we have a really healthy root system thriving in a healthy soil environment, that's going to build a stronger plant, a more resilient plant that's going to better fight off some of those diseases by having a really large population of beneficial microbes. And we'll talk a lot more about microbes as we go on throughout the rest of this presentation. But a great way to think about your compost pile is you're just making microbe magic happen. You are farming microbes in that compost pile. And that's what makes compost so healthy and helpful, is it's full of beneficial microbes. And all these things are going to go hand in hand to overall encourage abundant plant growth. But this is why we need to look at compost as a soil amendment first and foremost, and not just a fertilizer, because we're doing so much more than just fertilizing those plants and helping the plants grow. We're improving the entire growing environment as a whole. So I want to pull up this bread comparison here. It's a bit of a metaphor, but hopefully it'll make things make sense. So when you're making bread, right, you get this wonderful loaf at the end of this long process. But bread has multiple ingredients, right? But what's one of those fundamental ingredients you need to make bread? Flour. So think about flour being the equivalent of dry, sad, depleted soils. If you had just a plate full of plain flour, there's nothing else on the plate but just a pile of dry flour, and you were to pour water onto that. Now, when I do this class in person, I typically do a demonstration, so we'll have to use our imagination here. Right? That water is probably going to run off, make a goopy mess with that flour. But when we make a loaf of bread, it's the same thing as kind of making a compost pile. And what I mean by that is we're going to add in yeast, we're going to add in maybe some salt, or maybe an egg if we're making a brioche loaf or something sweeter, right? We're going to add in those ingredients. We let it rest, and then we're going to bake that bread. And at the end, we get this beautiful loaf that comes from very simple ingredients. And so the same thing applies to compost getting added into the soil. So if you took a slice of bread, right, all face up, so all those pores are open, and you added water onto the slice of bread, that slice of bread is going to do a much better job at absorbing the water, holding it in itself, instead of just the flour. Bread has flour, but also has all those other great ingredients. It has the yeast, which is kind of like what the microbes would do, that's going to give it activity. Think of it like a loaf of sourdough. So, Successful composting at home. We have a couple things that's going to accomplish. First of all, we're going to turn our unstable feedstocks into stable and usable products. Throughout this presentation, I might use the word feedstock often, and feedstock is just a technical term in the composting world for what are our inputs? What are the ingredients, the things that we're putting into the pile? We're feeding our compost with our feedstocks. So feedstocks could be leaves, food waste, manure, hay or straw, anything like that. And some of those are usually going to be unstable on their own, right? If you have a bucket of fresh food waste, if you just let that sit there, it's going to rot. It's going to attract pests, bugs, problems. It's going to stink. But by composting that, we can stabilize those things and create a usable product. That in turn is going to provide us with a beneficial soil amendment. And hopefully, if you're doing things correctly, it's not going to be a nuisance to yourself and it's not going to be a nuisance to your neighbors. Nobody wants a stinky pile. Nobody wants a giant magnet for bugs and flies. And by learning some of those tips and tricks about building a healthy compost pile, we'll be able to do it successfully. And a really good pile should smell like a forest floor. It shouldn't be stinky. So throughout today's workshop, we're going to learn to use what we have or what we may need to get. We're going to learn the basic principles of composting, things like carbon, nitrogen, what are the microbes at play, temperatures, turning, and some troubleshooting. And disregard the last bullet point as obviously we are online today, so there's no hands-on. So like I said before, there's not one size fits all for a compost bin at home. There are many different methods, there are many different bin systems that you can use, and it really depends on your needs, your own ability, and your space as far as what system might work best for your situation. So let's start in the upper left corner. We have this black bin. It's a pretty common bin that you might see if you just want to purchase something that's ready-made. The way those work typically is you build it up layer by layer, and you would have a slower compost going throughout that kind of bin. The black sides and the enclosed environment might help that generate a little bit more heat to get through some trickier ingredients. And then you would open up that bottom door and pull out stuff on the bottom. One of those bins might be better if you're doing a slow compost or what I call a cold compost. We'll learn more about what the cold versus hot means later on. But typically, you wouldn't want to use that style of bin if you were not wanting to really carefully track your temperatures. Also, if you're going to put things like meat, dairy, or any other animal products into your compost, you might want to have a bin that gets a little bit more agitation and action. It could be something as simple as the middle upper photo, just some pallets kind of nailed together to create a simple bay. It's very easy DIY. You can build it yourself. You can take recycled materials, and that's just going to give you some walls to house that bin. A personal favorite of mine for convenience is the upper right photo. That's a geo bin. It's simply a large, uh, very industrial rubber. It's kind of like a thick plasticky material roll that you would then use these little buckles to hold the two sides together. It's very easy to undo the clips and rebuild the bin right next to itself whenever it's time to turn. And then whenever you're not using it, you can roll it up and store it pretty easily. Same one goes for whatever's underneath that. It seems like it's just a bit of chicken wire or hardware fabric built around some posts. That's good for a larger leaf pile, or maybe you have some yard debris you just need to let sit and decompose for a while. We have the tumblers. These usually come in sets, like you see here, how there's two separate sides. But it's important to note that if you're buying a tumbler and you don't get one that comes with two separate containers, you need to get two of them. And that's because these really work as a batch system. I can compare it to baking a cake, right? If you're consistently putting in raw ingredients, raw feedstocks into the same side that you're tumbling and trying to get a finished product out, you're never going to get a truly cured finished compost if you're always adding raw ingredients into it. It's kind of like if you bake a cake, you put the dough in the oven, You wouldn't take it out halfway through and add more raw batter and then still expect it all to be cooked evenly. So if you're going to use a tumbler, I recommend getting two or getting one that has these two bin systems on that. And then, of course, we have the typical three bay system on the lower left side. And those are really common in community gardens or somewhere where you're dealing with a little bit more volume. And the best way to use these is filling up one side, typically starting from left, going to the right, stacking in your fresh waste that you're generating. Once that left side fills all the way up, you would turn that into the center bin, let that sit for a while you fill up the left side again. And then once that left side is full again, you would move everything down one row. So ideally, by the time that compost makes its way to the third trough on the end, that has had time to break down, it has had time to cure, and we will be able to always have a space to put in fresh waste on the left side. So just some ideas to think about different styles, different bins, and there's lots of different ways to make your pile at home. So there's lots of different factors that are going to affect the process of making that compost. Some of those are a little bit more complicated and some are just very simple. And we're going to go into all of these more in depth throughout the rest of this as well. So first and foremost, we have our carbon and nitrogen balance. Carbons and nitrogens are the building blocks of compost. Carbons are things that are typically we hear the browns and greens, right? Our browns are our carbons. Those are things like wood chips, dry dead leaves, mulch. Maybe we have some hay or sawdust, right? Anything that's full of carbon, more woody material, things are going to absorb some of that liquid. It's going to help bulk the pile. The carbons are also going to help absorb smells and hide the pile from pests. It's always very important to have extra carbon on hand. Typically, any problem can be solved with a little bit of carbon. We'll go into all that as well more. But those nitrogens are going to be things that are the volatile feedstocks, the things like food waste or fresh raw manure. Nitrogens are going to be the things that typically have leachate, liquids, smells, the things that are going to attract the pests. So if we have our carbons as the sort of neutralizing factor and the nitrogens are the thing we are trying to get rid of, we want to have more carbon than our nitrogen. We want more browns than greens. So the general rule of thumb that I recommend is 2 to 3 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. So if you have a bin, you say, okay, how much does that actually mean I need? Well, if you're putting in 5 gallons of food waste into your compost pile every week, you need to have 2 to 3 times that amount of carbon on hand to balance that out. So just generally remember you want more browns than greens, usually about 2 to 3 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. Moisture is also going to be a very important part of the pile, as the moisture is the place where our microbes will live. So I've got some photos later on that are going to show a clear example of this, but we want our pile to have moisture. Usually that is about a 60% range. So what that means in simple, terms to figure that out is if you squeeze a handful of your compost, it should sound a little bit wet, but it shouldn't be running full of water. So I recommend to do the squeeze test to gauge the moisture of your pile. So how you do that is you would pick up a handful, squeeze it out, and what you want ideally is just a drop or two of liquid to come out of that handful. If you have a full stream of liquid running out, you're probably a little bit too moist, and you can add in some carbon to dry that out. If you have nothing, you might want to add a little bit of water onto your pile. It could be as simple as opening the lid if you have a closed bin, or closing a lid if you have a very open bin. But we'll talk about that in more in depth as well. Aeration and oxygen are very important to our pile as well because those all go back into our microbial action. And then, of course, temperature thresholds. So temperature comes into play depending on what we're going to put into that pile. And then, of course, our turning frequency and our curing are going to affect our compost as well. So, generally, the more we turn a pile, the more we are going to help break materials down, and the quicker we will get a finished product. And of course, we always want to make sure that we cure our compost before we use it and before we apply it in our garden, as we want to give it time to let some of those more volatile microbes calm down and finish digesting. And we want to let everything come to a nice, homogenized humus material. So, life in the pile is very important to understand that it's all coming down to the microbes. We have fungi, actinomyces, and bacteria. And all those microbes are going to need moisture and oxygen. And they're going to off-put just a small amount of CO2. This small amount of CO2 put off from the microbes, though, is nothing to worry about in comparison to the amount of methane that would be released from that food waste or other organic material rotting anaerobically if it were to go to a landfill. Right, so when we have landfills, all of that stuff gets compressed. There's no airflow, there's no oxygen, and it is releasing different offputs than it would if we were to aerobically compost them in a compost pile. So all of this is just coming down to facilitating our healthy microbiome in our compost pile. And that comes back to moisture. So how do we have healthy microbes in our pile? We need to make sure that we have that moisture level balanced. So like I said before, there's that moisture level, and that is where our microbes are going to live. So this is, hopefully you can see the little image here on the right. There's a liquid film around each of these particles, whether it's a particle of carbon or nitrogen. We want that moisture in the pile to create that film around everything. And it's within that film of liquid where we're going to have the microorganisms thriving. You can also see that we have little arrows showing free airspace, pore space, and airflow. It's important that we have mixing in the pile, we're turning our pile, and it comes down to texture as well. We want some of that airflow in the pile so that we have the right kind of microbes. We want aerobic microbes, meaning ones that are breathing oxygen. So if you have a really slow pile, things are rotting maybe, or there's just the temperature's not increasing, it might be because your pile is too dry. And if the pile is too dry, there's just simply nowhere for those microbes to live. So if you take away anything, remember to keep an eye on the moisture. We don't want it to be bone dry, and we won't want it sopping wet. We want to get that squeeze test and look for just a few drops of liquid coming out, and that means you're probably at a pretty good moisture level for that compost. So let's start with the feedstocks now. What are we going to put into our pile? So like I said before, we have our carbons, our nitrogens, these are the browns and our greens. And generally we want more browns than our greens. So that ratio of 2 to 3 parts brown to 1 part green. Our greens are nitrogens. They're going to add moisture, adding energy. These are essential for cell growth. These could be things like fresh grass, food waste, green yard waste, like fresh grass clippings or whatever else is coming out of the garden, or manure that's raw, fresh manure. Some manures, depending on the animal, can have a balance of both nitrogen and carbon, but generally you would always want to still balance that out with some extra carbon. And so those are going to be things adding bulk, absorbing liquid, acting as that biofilter. Could be stuff like mulch, wood shavings and wood chips, or hay and straw. Carbons are going to be really essential to having a healthy pile. They're going to absorb all of that liquid. They're going to prevent smell from escaping. They're also going to bulk the pile and they're going to add structure and airflow. And remember that airflow is important for giving oxygen and giving room for those microbes to breathe as well. Our nitrogens, our greens, these are the energy. So these are usually going to be our wet, smelly things. And anytime you're adding a nitrogen, adding your green, your food waste into your pile, you want to make sure that it is buried deeply inside your pile, at least 6 inches below a level of carbon. Because if you can see the food, an animal or a bug can smell it from a mile away. And typically, the reason you might have flies or some bugs in your pile is that that food might be exposed, whether on the sides or the top of the bin. So if you're having pests in your compost pile, you might want to start by just adding a thicker layer of carbons just onto the surface of the pile to act as that biofilter to bury them deeper down. Some other feedstocks to consider that are still organic materials but might not fall necessarily into either carbon or nitrogen would be things like hair from maybe your dog. If you're grooming your dog and you have a whole bunch of fur, you can absolutely put that into your compost pile. Feathers, maybe if you have some chickens or something, right? But one falls in, came from nature, and it too can go back to nature. Eggshells, definitely compostable, but they're one of those weird ingredients that aren't necessarily a carbon or a nitrogen. They certainly add a little bit of calcium and texture. And then things like wool rags. Things I would recommend to avoid putting into your compost, though, are ashes that can affect the pH. It can also cake and bulk up the pile in a negative way because of it's such a fine, dusty material. Of course, anything that's glossed, like magazines or waxed paper or waxed cardboard, that wax is going to inhibit proper composting. Any inorganic materials, like plastics or metals, of course, as those won't break down. And then feces or droppings from cats or dogs. Those are not going to be beneficially incorporated into your backyard pile. Now, of course, you can do livestock mortality composting, should that be something you would need to do, but that is a very highly monitored process and more complicated than a typical backyard pile. So, if we're doing composting just in our backyard, steer clear of any kind of uh, cat or dog droppings, as those have a completely different microbiome as well. So, what about meat and animal products? It all depends on temperature. If you are tracking temperatures in your compost pile and you're noticing that you are consistently hitting the thermophilic range, which is a very important term here, that means that you're getting over 131 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 days in a row consecutively, and you hit that 3 day cycle twice. So, an example would be I built my pile and I'm tracking that temperature every day with a compost thermometer. And a week after I built it, I noticed that it hit 131 degrees and it sat at 131 degrees or higher for at least 3 days. And then it might start to cool down. So that would be my cue to maybe I need to turn the pile, give it a little boost of oxygen, a boost of air, and then it heated up again the next week for another 3 days. That would be 2 cycles within that thermophilic range. That is the USDA standard range for generally deeming a compost pile to have been safely processing through any kind of potentially harmful pathogens or bacteria. So this can be achieved in a backyard pile, but you need a certain bulk. So usually the minimum size is 3 feet wide, 3 feet deep, and about 3 feet high. That's going to be enough volume to gain and retain that heat. And that's just going to come from having enough of a microbe population in a pile to generate heat that high. So you're probably not going to be able to achieve that high temperature if you're not building a pile that size. If you don't want to take the time to track your temperatures or have a more labor-intensive compost pile. And if you're concerned with food safety, those are all reasons why I would say steer clear of adding any meat or animal products into your backyard bin. You can think of it kind of like from a pasteurization sort of process, I guess. If you're putting something into your pile and it's not properly breaking down, you're going to face the consequences of that whenever you go and apply that compost back into your garden. So if you're putting any kind of meat or animal products in, please do make sure that you are building a bigger pile and tracking those temperatures. So what about weeds or invasives going into that pile? So the same thing goes for meat or animal products. Weeds and invasive plants usually have some form of seed on them, or the plant itself would go off and propagate. So think about weeds, invasive plants, the same way you would think of meat, right? We want to hit that 131 for 3 days twice. And that's because those need to be killed off. Those seeds need to be cooked away from the heat of the pile. And it's highly likely that if you're not getting those thermophilic temperatures and you're putting in some invasive plants or some weeds, those are just going to incubate in that pile. And if you're not hitting that 131, that thermophilic range, you go and apply that compost all across your yard, and those plants are just going to pop up because those seeds have likely just hidden themselves. The plant itself might break down, but it could still have hidden seeds in there. And as far as compostable plastics and other difficult things to compost at home, typically most compostable plastic products are biodegradable within commercial environments. Composting at home, we're not going to be putting this through a grinder or a highly mechanized sifter like they would have at a big commercial operation. So most of those, you can keep cycling them through your pile if you do want to sift them out, but they likely won't break down all the way when you're doing this just in a backyard pile. So now we're going to get into some of the pile building structure, layering and building your compost pile. This is going to be really important to understand as far as just setting up your pile for success. If you build it correctly as you go, it's going to do a lot of that self-maintenance and it's going to be easier to maintain a healthy pile. So, most importantly, our greens, our nitrogens, we never want any of that to be visible in the pile. Should always have a nice layer of browns, carbons covering the bottoms, the sides, and the top of our pile. So I recommend that you start pile, you're starting from ground zero, creating sort of a bowl of your browns. So adding at least a 6-inch layer down to the bottom of your pile, and then building up the sides so that whenever you add in your next bowl of greens, you can bulk those up in about 6-inch layers and then alternating. Always cover your pile with at least about 6 inches of our browns or our carbons. Think of it like a big lasagna, right? So this photo on the right is showing our browns at the bottom, and then greens, browns, greens, browns. This is just a little bit of a graphic. Of course, it's not a real bin, but just to show you want to have those layers. And having that layering method is going to help liquids be properly absorbed. It's going to help smells be properly absorbed. It's going to bulk and aerate the pile, allow for airflow between these layers of moisture. And that's all going to go into building a healthier microbe population and promoting more microbial growth within the pile. So this photo is a little bit more exactly what I would recommend you build. So as you can see here, you've got your bowl of browns on the bottom. And then as you go in and add food waste, or maybe it's fresh yard waste like grass clippings, we want to always make sure that our greens, our nitrogens are tucked away nice and cozy inside layers of brown. And all of the sides of the bin and the top of the bin have that layer of carbon on it, that layer of our browns material. And that's just going to keep everything tucked away. It's going to let the nitrogens, our greens, get decomposed by our microbes. It's going to prevent animals from smelling it. It's going to prevent bugs from getting into it. And it's just going to help build a healthier moisture environment within that as well. It's so, so important to remember you never want any visible food. If you have food sitting out on top of your pile, it's just going to rot up there. It's not going to be absorbed and decomposed by those microbes as if it were buried down within the pile. So just always make sure that your greens are tucked away within a nice layer of our browns. And think of it like a big lasagna. So what if I can't fill a bin all at once, right? Most people are not picking up 10 gallons of food waste every day from a market or a restaurant, and you might only have a little bit of coffee grounds coming out of your kitchen every day. Or you might just have, a banana peel every couple days. And that's not going to be enough to fill a bin all at once and get those high, hot temperatures right away. So what that's going to mean is you're going to probably just have more of a cold compost pile. And that's totally still composting, Nothing wrong with that. We just might not see high hot temperatures. So, what is the difference between cold and hot composting? Cold composting is going to happen when we fill that bin more slowly. Like I said, we're not going to generate high heat right away, but that means that that pile should not contain any meat, dairy, or weeds, as we're not going to be able to hit that thermophilic range and we won't be able to break down those pathogens or seeds. This is going to mean it's a less labor-intensive pile, take a little bit less work, but it can handle, fewer feedstocks and some of those more tricky ingredients. Now, if we want to get some of those high temperatures, we want a hot compost pile. That usually has to happen by filling your bin more quickly, finding bulks of materials. You can do that by freezing some food waste to do it in big batches, or seeking food waste from places outside of your home if you want to make a large quantity of compost. And this is going to send that whole pile through these cycles as a batch. We're going to have a more potential for heat generation. And if you're tracking your heat and getting those series of 131 degrees for 3 days or more, then that's your cue that you can start to add in some of those more volatile feedstocks like dairy, meat, maybe some weeds or invasive plants, and it's actually going to be able to fully break that down. However, those hot compost piles will usually be a bit more labor intensive and will take a little bit more maintenance. So let's go through building what would be a hot compost pile. All right, so stage one is our initial pile build. Our pile is the same temperature as the air. Food is still identifiable. Hopefully, it is buried down within a layer of carbons, but it's identifiable as to if I dig into that bin, I'd say, okay, there's an orange peel. I can see what that was. The pile is not yet active with its full population of microbes, and we're just going to layer up our pile and then let that sit for at least about a week before we would see any kind of huge progress. If you're building it up slowly, it might take more time to fill that bin all the way and acquire the volume needed to generate enough heat, so this would be called your cold composting if you're building it slowly. Stage two is going to be the heat generation. So our pile temperature would likely start to go up. The microbes are activating, the microbes are starting to digest things and break it down. And that microbial movement and digestion is actually what's generating the heat. So a hot pile means it is microbially very active. Our food might still be a little bit visible, but stuff's probably starting to look broken down and decomposed. And remember, for cold composting, no heat, no meat. Stage three is going to be noticeable decomposition. The pile is staying warm, going through heat cycles with turnings, and those microbes are still very active within the pile. Some of that decomposition is more noticeable. Some stuff may still be identifiable, but that volume should also start to reduce. So typically a compost pile would reduce by maybe a little bit less than a third in volume from start to finish, just from things breaking down. And then we're going to repeat turning that pile every week or so to keep letting air flow into that, mixing those things around, and just watching that cycle go through until things are no longer visible or identifiable. And so for cold composting, right, that's not going to happen as quickly. So full decomposition of our feedstocks, if we're cold composting, will take a lot longer, typically at least 6 months up to 2 years potentially. Stage four is time to cure. So compost is now decomposed, feedstocks are no longer identifiable. Maybe some of those carbons that you put in are still noticeable, like some wood chips or twigs or branches. However, that compost still needs time to cure. Curing is when you just let the compost sit, and this should happen for at least 4 weeks, and it could go anywhere up to 4 months or longer. What we want to look for is the temperature of the pile cooling down to ambient temperatures. We no longer want to have those spikes and dips in the heat cycle, and that means that those microbes have done their work and the pH will find its own way to a neutral level. And that's when that really nice humus material is produced. That's what we want to build the tilth and the texture of our soil. It's so important to let your compost sit and cure before you apply it into your garden because those microbes are still breathing oxygen. Your compost isn't, it's breathing because it's full of these microbes. So if we were to say put very raw, hot compost onto a bunch of tiny little plants, that can actually affect the growth of that plant by outcompeting that oxygen in the available environment because the soil is still breathing all that oxygen, sucking it right away from that plant. Could also still have a hot temperature, which could be harmful to very sensitive tiny roots. And so we just want to make sure we always give our compost at least 4 weeks to sit aside and cure before applying or using it. So when it's sitting in that curing stage, or even towards the end of some of those heat cycles, we might start to notice that white, sort of dusty layer. And typically you'll notice it as sort of like a shell or as a capped growing layer throughout the pile. And that's not anything to be concerned about. That is most likely the actinomyces. Actinomyces are a type of fungus that's going to help humify the rest of that pile. So these are going to give off that earthy smell of soil. When you pick up soil or you go into a forest and you sort of smell that earthy smell of soil, really what you're smelling are actinomyces. So these are friends, not foes. If you see this kind of thing in your pile, usually not going to be a concern. It just means that everything is finishing its microbial cycles. So do I really need to cure it? Yes. Raw or freshly finished compost is not suitable for immediate planting. The microbes, the temperatures, the acidity all need time to settle. So we want to give this at least 4 weeks to cure, preferably longer. And that immature compost, like I said, it's still breathing oxygen because it's still very, very active with maybe some of those thermophilic microbes or some of those more active microbes. There's all different kinds of microbes present in the compost pile, but we want to give time for the really, really active ones to settle down and move out, and for the more room ambient temperature, those mesophilic microbes to repopulate that pile. There was a biodome study that happened a while ago where there is an enclosed building and scientists were trying to figure out if we can live and grow in these biodomes. And what noticed over time was that the oxygen levels actually kept depleting inside that biodome. And they tried to figure out what it is. We have plants in there. Why is it going down so low? And it all came back to the fact that they put in raw compost into the beds in that biodome. And that compost and the microbes within that compost were still decomposing and still breathing out that oxygen. So it's so important to let that compost cure before we apply it and use it. So I touched a little bit on turning, and we're going to just take a step back and go over turning in our compost pile, right? So we've gone over a bit of the life cycle. We know what our feedstocks, our greens and our browns are going to be. But now, how do we know when it's time to turn? And how do we work with these microbes to make sure that we get a healthy pile? So turning can be dependent upon time or temperature. And we want to make sure that we are giving some turning, some attention to the pile, as it's going to help reignite oxygen throughout that pile, right? We're moving things around, we're shuffling those particles around. That little bit of mechanical digestion is going to help break stuff down. So if we are, let's say we're going to track our temperatures, we are doing a very high maintenance compost pile. I go out there once a day and I track my temperatures. And I noticed, oh, I hit up to 131 degrees and now it's starting to cool. We want to watch for that drop in temperatures, and that drop is the signal to turn the pile. By turning it, we're going to boost our airflow. That's going to help those microbes breathe. and the microbes will start to digest again. And remember, it's the microbial digestion, the microbial action that will increase the temperature. Now, maybe we're not going to take our time to track temperatures, don't want to go through all the trouble for that, or don't have the time to do that, then I would recommend at least turning once a week or every other week. The more you turn, the faster your compost is going to break down. If you do little to no turning, it can definitely still break down, but it's just going to take quite a bit more time. The no turn or slow turn is going to be more of a cold compost pile. Totally okay. Just remember, don't put anything tricky like meat, dairy, or animal products, weed seeds into a cold pile. And if we're getting that high hot pile, those need to breathe. They need to be turned. So this little graphic here is, I'm going to explain this a little bit here. So down in the lower left corner, right, we've got 0 days and we are starting our pile. So we're going to build everything up. Let's say we're going to layer up a nice big lasagna bin. We're going to go for some hot temperatures. What we'll notice within that first week is the temperature is going to spike. There's lots of volatile nitrogen in there, lots of greens to be digested, and the microbes are going to get very active right away. And we're going to see some of those thermophilic microbes. Those are the ones that are going to break down that tricky stuff, the bad pathogens, the bad bacteria, things like that. But then at a certain point, those are going to slow down. They've done what they can do with the pile as it is, and the temperatures are going to drop. And that is going to be our signal to turn the bin. When we turn the bin, we're going to reignite that oxygen again, just really drilling this home to remind how everything is connected, right? Our movement within a pile, the pile structure, and the microbes are all going to affect how things are decomposing. So every time the temperature drops, it's our signal to turn that pile again, boost the oxygen, and slowly over time, those microbes are going to eat away at the available nitrogen. They're going to eat away at the available food, and we won't notice it getting as hot every time. But once things start to calm down, the temperatures are lowering. That's showing you that those microbes are going towards the end of their cycle. And there's different kinds of microbes here. And so this is what I mean by a hot pile can handle certain kinds of things like meat or weeds, and a colder pile simply cannot, is there are different microbes present at different temperature thresholds. So in the mesophilic range, we're going to see it's going to be around 50 degrees to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. These are the mesophilic microbes. These are the guys that are around at room temperature, and these will recolonize the pile once the curing is happening as well. That's typically the most abundant microbe within our compost pile. However, we also have our thermophilic microbes, and these are only present at around 110 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. The thermophilic microbes are the key to safe soil when we're using any kind of animal product, any weeds or invasives in our compost pile. And I remember again that USDA standard for hitting a thermophilic pile and including some of those trickier things is 131 degrees for 3 days twice. It's not likely that you're going to get over 175 degrees in a backyard pile, but it is possible, especially in some of those larger commercial operations, but not typically going to happen in a backyard bin. So this is just a little temperature range here to show how there's just different bacteria, there's different microbes populating your pile at different temperature thresholds. So that pathogen destruction and then that weed seed destruction is really only going to happen if we're getting a hot pile. And that's why it's so important to know just don't put those things into your backyard bin unless you're going to go for a larger pile. We're going to track our temperatures, try and get that thermophilic range because you're likely going to face those weeds again when you're applying that compost if it hasn't gotten hot enough to fully break those down. So we've made our compost, we've successfully built a healthy population of microbes, and we have decomposed our lovely carbons and nitrogens. And now it's time to use our compost. So, great way to use it is making your own potting soil blend. Compost can be very rich, and we want to dilute that a little bit. So, depending on whatever else you're using, all based on personal preference, you could either mix it into your existing topsoil, you could get other kinds of moss or other feedstocks, cocoa coir, but you'd want that compost to make up just about a third of your total recipe. We don't want to plant into just straight compost as it's a little bit too rich for plants to actually benefit from it the way that it would make the most difference. We want to dilute that a little bit. You could also use it as a cover mulch by adding about a 2 to 3 inch layer around plants just on the surface of your soil. And then, of course, you can use it to amend your soils every year by adding about 1 to 2 inches and then mixing that lightly into the top 6 inches of your soil. And all of that is just going to help, again, improve the tilth of your soil, water retention, erosion prevention. We're going to build that soil environment. We're going to amend our soils. And all of that is in turn going to help our plants grow and thrive. So now to wrap this up, we've got just a few minutes left here. We're going to talk a little bit about some troubleshooting. So we'll go through some different symptoms, what the problem might be, and what our solution could be to that. So let's say our pile is wet and it smells like a mixture of rancid butter or vinegar or rotten eggs. The pile has probably gone anaerobic, meaning there's no oxygen. And that's coming from compaction. There might not be enough airflow. There's too much nitrogen, and it's probably too wet. Stuff has just gotten dense, wet, compacted, and the pile's having a hard time breathing. So, solution to that would be to mix in some carbons, bulk that up, and turn that pile. We'd want to make sure that it's in a nice, well draining area, adding some things in for structure, maybe like wood chips or straw, and maybe something a little bit finer and drier like sawdust to absorb some of that liquid. Let's say our pile's not heating up. Well, it's either too dry or it's just too small to have a large enough volume to generate that heat. You could try adding a little bit of water while you're turning the pile, or just making your pile larger or insulating it a little bit better if it might be too windy in an area. Maybe the pile is damp and sweet smelling, but it's not heating up. You probably don't have enough nitrogen. So you could try doing something like adding in fresh grass clippings, fresh food scraps, or other sources of nitrogen. If your pile is attracting animals, maybe you've put in some meat or dairy products into a cold pile and they're not actually breaking down properly, or the food scraps are not well covered. We always want to keep meat and dairy out of a pile unless we're hitting that thermophilic range. You could also try enclosing your pile in a little bit more of a sturdy material. Maybe there's cracks or holes where animals are getting in. And then, of course, you can always try to cover it with more browns, more carbons, such as wood chips, or even finished compost that you have on hand, as that'll act as a great biofilter as well. So, as you can see, most of these are solved very simply by either adding in a carbon or adding in a nitrogen and finding that ratio, finding that balance, as well as keeping track of a nice moisture level. So all of these things are affecting each other, right? And it's all just about remembering the fundamental aspects of a healthy compost pile and then making it work for whatever your situation is. So turning our pile allows for more oxygen to get to our microbes. It's going to mix the pile and it's going to promote decomposition. The more often you turn, the faster you're going to have decomposition. If you never turn your pile, it's just going to take a lot longer to decompose. Our temperature is going to tell us how active the pile is, right? Because that temperature is being generated by microbial digestion. And it's also going to be a key to tell you when it's time to turn our pile, especially if we have a hot bin. So if we're tracking our temperature and we notice the increase and then we start to see the dip, the temperature drop is when it's time to turn. Carbon and nitrogen are the building blocks that are going to fuel this whole process, along with adding a bit of moisture and making sure we have oxygen and airflow in that pile. And all of those go hand in hand with fueling our microbes. And the moisture is so important to allowing that microbial growth. That can come from your feedstocks or can be added in by watering your pile when you turn it. And it all comes back to our microbes. The microbes are the ones generating that heat and generating the decomposition. So, really, we're just farming a bunch of microbes when we're making our compost pile. So, taking everything we've learned, how do we get started? Of course, it's cold and wintry out, so now might not be the ideal time to start a compost bin, but all good things to keep in mind for when things start to thaw out. Find your spot. Right, so find an ideal location that's going to be easy to access for yourself, easy to get to from the kitchen or wherever you're collecting your food waste, and then also to easy to use in your garden. You want to stock up and collect a large bin of browns, collect your bin of carbons. It's so important to have a layer of browns on the bottom and on the sides at all time, and just generally to keep some of those around on hand. And if you want to build up a pile, you can generate some green stock up by keeping some stuff in your freezer or seeking out some extra greens from neighbors or somewhere else if you want to build up a big bin at once. When it's time to build your bin, remember to do that lasagna layering. Make sure you've got the browns and carbons layered throughout the greens so that we have airflow. Make sure there's a little bit of moisture within there. And then we want to check our temperature as we go. You want to turn your bin weekly to make sure you're letting that breathe. So just depends on the bin size and the bin style as far as how often you might turn that bin, but the more you turn it, the faster it's going to decompose. And then finally, you want to let things cure. So once materials have looked fully decomposed and are no longer identifiable, we want to let that compost sit aside for at least 4 weeks to 4 months or more and let it cure before we use it and plant with it. And all of this goes back into making a healthier food cycle, a healthier waste management cycle, and we can all have our own hand in helping our own communities be healthier, whether it's small scale collection programs or collecting food scraps in your own home. That can go back through composting to create healthy soils, which in turn creates healthier food, more nutrient dense produce, which goes back into our bodies and makes healthier lives. So I hope you all enjoyed this presentation and learned a little something today. If you guys don't have any questions or anything, feel free to reach out to me at my email. It's emh275@cornell.edu. If anyone happens to have a phone on them, and you could go ahead and scan this QR code, fill out a little form for us just to see how we did and stay in touch. Would definitely appreciate that to help make sure we're getting the right programming to everybody. But thank you so much, and I will take a peek at the chat and see what we've got here. Hmm. Right. How do we maintain the 2:3:1 ratio after turning the pile and having to add 6 inches of carbon to all sides and the top of the pile? That's a great question. So, generally speaking, that 2 to 3 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen is going to be the important ratio to remember when building that pile. Or if you're adding in a large stock of greens, maybe just balance it out by adding a little bit more browns. If you're going through the turning cycle and you see a lot of food become exposed, you can try and manually tuck some of that back into the inside of the pile, or just adding in a layer of browns on top, just enough to kind of cover up some of those exposed food, but without affecting the overall ratio too much. It says in the city, it's fairly easy to get and save leaves in the fall. Where can we get greens? Well, you can go to coffee shops and restaurants and ask if they are willing to donate any food waste. You could start neighborhood collection systems. I've known people who have gone around and put big bins in their driveway, and the neighbors in the area just happen to know that they can go and drop off some food scraps in the person's yard and they'll use it to make compost. Finding greens sometimes might just need to get creative with looking for large bulks of that. Not a lot of cities usually have food waste collection networks. A lot of that happens at a kind of grassroots level. But also happy to help someone get set up with something if this is something that you want to pursue in a larger program type of situation. Mhm. Okay. Unless I'm missing any other questions here, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you so much. Oh, I'm seeing the chat is disabled. There's a Q&A tab where you can send in questions. I'm also happy to enter my email here in the chat. And if anyone else has further questions, you can go ahead and email those directly to me, and I'd be more than happy to work through any questions or problem solving that you might have related to your composting. But thank you so much to everyone for coming online tonight and joining us. This will be recorded and sent out to anyone who registered tonight. We'll send out the recording so you can have all these resources and my contact information for your use in the future. Thank you so much and have a great night.